May the 24th, 1978. 65 Kensington Gardens Square, London W2. 7 a.m. A group of armed police, acting on instructions from the Special Branch, move in on the top floor flat. They arrest 2 young anarchists, members of the International Black Cross organization. Later that same day, in Fleet Street, Albert Meltzer, one of the men who founded the anarchist Black Cross network, is on his way to work as a copy taker at the Daily Telegraph. By chance and amazing irony, one of the first stories he takes at night is about the arrests. No names are mentioned, but Meltzer doesn't need them. He knows who it is. He brings a solicitor, the paper prints the story, and so begins the first anarchist clash with authority since the days of the Angry Brigade. But today's new wave culture is 6 years on from the libertarian era of the Stoke Newington 8, as the Angry Brigade was sometimes called. Different people, different attitudes, different politics, different lifestyles, and above all, different reaction to it all from the authorities, a reaction conditioned by the years of terrorist war in Northern Ireland and the effect that that's had on security in Britain as a whole. Specifically, though, the background of the trial that ended today starts at a scene that couldn't be further from the punk rock platform of an anarchist gig. The tiny island of Sanday in the Orkneys, home of Stuart Christie, who lives here in a kind of self-imposed exile, running a successful anarchist publishing business.
2369. Well, I've just received your brochure, in fact, and haven't had a chance. I've just come back from London. And
in the 60s, Christie was sentenced to 20 years in a Spanish jail for trying to blow up General Franco. Later, in Britain, he was charged with Angry Brigade offences, acquitted, and now spends a good deal of his time preparing, writing, and commissioning articles for an anarchist paper called The Black Flag.
Okie dokie, Mr. Jeffrey. Right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Copies of the paper arrive in Sanday in bulk by plane from the printers in London every fortnight.
Well, the Black Flag has 2 functions. One, to provide information regarding anarchist and libertarian prisoners throughout the world. And the other function is that of propaganda and comments on topical subjects from an anarchist perspective.
So the message goes out from Stuart Christie's office in the Orkneys to Black Flag readers and anarchist prisoners all over the world. Sometimes the authorities let the paper through, sometimes they don't, and copies are destroyed or politely sent back. But there's one prison we do know the Black Flag got through to. We know because someone there read it, liked it, and wanted to know more. That prison was Long Kesh on Ireland. In 1975, the prison huts, or cages as they were called, were divided into groups. The provisional IRA prisoners in some huts, loyalists in others, the official IRA separate again. In cage 14, towards the end of 1975, was an 18-year-old member of the Irish Republican Socialist Party, a breakaway from the official IRA. Ronan Bennett was in Long Kesh waiting for the result of an appeal against his conviction for murdering an RUC man during an armed robbery. To pass the time, Bennett started to read copies of the Black Flag. Bennett was intrigued by the views expressed in the paper and wrote off asking for more information about who worked for it and where it was published. His letter was printed in the next edition. In it, he said he wanted to establish contact with anyone sharing your politics who'd be willing to swap a few letters with him. Just one requirement, he said, it had to be a woman. That woman, on Stuart Christie's instructions, was to be Iris Mills, then the local secretary of the Black Cross. A New Zealand girl, she's a former probation officer, a BA in psychology, and an anarchist of long standing. She wrote back to Bennett, and so began what can only be described as a lengthy political dialogue. The Long Kesh letters, as they came to be called at the trial, outlined Bennett's political views at the time. Resistance does more to politicize the working classes than any print or leaflets, he wrote. It's time to stop protesting and start fighting. Bennett said he'd always regarded anarchism as a joke. It was through his correspondence with Iris Mills that he began to take it seriously. Not, of course, that he was by any means the first person to do that.
Well, anarchy is a universal human phenomenon in all societies, among all sorts of individuals, simply people who don't want to do what they're told and decide to do what they want to do.
Now, the public view of anarchy is one of chaos and violence. Why do you think that is?
That's a very complex question. I think the main reason why that still is the image of anarchy is that the media are very anxious to keep it so, and the press and television and radio will always label as anarchy anything which appears to be chaotic or disorderly. In fact, anarchy wants far more order than there was before, but they want it imposed from below rather than from above.
But anarchism does have a violent background and violent beliefs.
It has a violent line of belief. There always has been a small minority of anarchists who believe that the best way to cut through all the rubbish around us is by violence.
Anarchist rock groups like Crass, a growing phenomenon among the young these days, would certainly disapprove of that violent minority of anarchists Nicholas Walter was talking about. The group went round giving benefit concerts for the people on trial at the Old Bailey. Crass and what they represent are attacked politically from all sides. The right see them simply as criminals out to destroy the existing structures of society. The left see them as hopeless utopians, deviationists, nearer to a bunch of bandits. As for the authorities, they don't like anarchists in general because they're unpredictable. You can never tell how they're going to react to a given political situation. Safe so long as their aggression expresses itself in music, for example. Dangerous if they decide on some kind of direct action against authority. The kind of action they suspected Ronan Bennett had been involved with in Belfast. But in Northern Ireland at the beginning of 1976, the appeal court quashed Bennett's conviction for murder, and after 14 months in Long Kesh, he returned to his old haunts a free man. Not that anyone with his kind of Republican background were really free in Belfast. Bennett knew that to be a prime target for the militant Protestant groups, and he also said he was worried about the RUC's constant presence on the streets of the city. He considered them a threat to his freedom as well. In his letters to Irish Mills, Bennett wrote about his disenchantment with the existing Irish terrorist organisations. He was looking for something new, he said, a group that had a tightly knit, effective military machine to back up its political gains. But overall, he was growing more interested in what Irish Mills was telling him. And what with that and the fact that life seemed far from safe in Belfast, he made up his mind to get out. In May 1976, Bennett arrived in Huddersfield, home of his Long Kesh correspondent Irish Mills, and before his Orkney days of Stuart Christie.
A number of local secretaries of the Black Cross in different parts of the world have been murdered. Well, they've been victims of very strange accidents. And throughout the world since then, local activists within the Black Cross have been victims of surveillance, strict surveillance, and under the close attention of the various security services of the world.
And Huddersfield was no exception. The local special branch began to take an interest in Bennett and the people he was mixing with in the area. One clue to just why there was so much concern about Bennett emerged quite recently in a secret army intelligence report on future terrorist trends. In it there are several references to the growth of links between the IRA and overseas terrorist groups. Specifically, the document says that the official IRA devotes much time and effort to maintaining links with subversive organizations in Europe. Was Bennett perhaps acting as a sort of official IRA infiltrator, using the Black Cross International Network for the Irish cause? Rightly or wrongly, it wasn't something the security people were prepared to leave to chance. A decision was taken to send Bennett back to Ireland. It was left to the Huddersfield police to do the job. They arrested Bennett and Iris Mills and applied for an exclusion order under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But the move failed. The assessor judged that there wasn't enough evidence to justify Bennett's exclusion, and they were both released, convinced now that the authorities were out to get them at any price, that for Bennett, England wasn't so safe after all.
Ne soyons plus esclaves sous le drapeau ralliant. Sous nos pas brisons les entraves. 89, réveillez-vous. 89.
Over the years, Paris has had more than its share of violence in pursuit of political aims. The city's also traditionally been a centre for anarchist politics. It's even said that the Sacré-Cœur Cathedral in Montmartre was built by grateful authorities to celebrate victory over the communards in 1871. For a few brief months, the people of Paris had taken the law, the government, and the army's weapons into their own hands to establish a self-managed workers' commune. It was their defeat on the barricades and the huge number of casualties they sustained at the hands of government troops that finally persuaded some of their leaders to abandon the idea of open, head-on confrontation with the state and to build up secret societies, underground networks instead. That tradition has come down to the present day. Dozens of exiled terrorist groups base themselves here, including one called the International Revolutionary Solidarity Movement, the 1st of May group, which had links with the Angora Brigade and which, say the police, provided them with their weaponry. Into this highly charged political atmosphere in the summer of 1977 came Mills and Bennett. Armed with the addresses of Black Cross contacts, they were accepted as comrades and received as people being persecuted by the police. As they began to mix in the student life of the city, they were warned not to get involved with anyone suspected of being watched by the authorities. Towards the end of 1977, one of the issues students in France and elsewhere in Europe were concerned with was the terrorist situation in West Germany. After the deaths of Bader, Meinhof and Enslin in the Stammheim prison, there were demonstrations throughout Europe. Britain had a support group called Black Aid, based largely on Rising Free Bookshop in Islington. Again, its roots go back to the days of Agitprop and the Angora Brigade.
Well, although not everyone in the collective is an anarchist, we all share common political beliefs, and that we're opposed to exploitation, oppression, and class divisions within society. Rising Free's main function is to disseminate literature, to give people the opportunity to read about, develop, understand non-manipulative, non-authoritarian alternatives to what exists today.
Not everyone who bought books from Rising Free, of course, necessarily shared the same political views. There were debates and disagreements even among members of the Black Cross. Bennett and Mills, for example, disapproved of the hero worship some people seem to be giving to the Bader-Meinhof group. But another Black Cross member, David Ladd, who'd been deported from West Germany because of his terrorist connections there, disagreed. He supported anyone prepared to take arms against the state. One of Ladd's political associates was Stuart Carr, who'd served with him in Albany prison. He told police later that he'd always been interested in politics. "That's why I'm a thief," he said. Carr was soon mixing in Black Cross and Rising Free circles, and at meetings there and at Conway Hall, where Iris Mills was working as letting secretary, a group began to emerge with a common interest in the kind of politics that the authorities obviously found unacceptable, and something to keep a very careful eye on. But it wasn't until Mills and Bennett were living at Kensington Gardens Square that the police were finally given orders to move in on them. On the pretext of searching for stolen medical cars, the Special Branch organised a raid. The man who briefed the police before they went out was a Special Branch officer who'd been on many raids himself in the past, this one at Time Out during the hunt for the Angora Brigade. Special Branch Detective Roy Creamer, an anarchist specialist, is the man at the yard most familiar with the politics and personality of the so-called libertarian left. He told the local police what to look for. What they found, though, wasn't that much. Inside the flat there were signs hidden away of the clandestine life, false passports, birth certificates and stolen driving licenses. There was a kind of weed killer that can be used in explosives, and with it the anarchist cookbook, a kind of do-it-yourself guide to bomb-making, booby traps and poisons. The kind of book, the prosecution said later, that no law-abiding person would have in this country, a recipe for death and mutilation. The defendants said they regarded the anarchist cookbook simply as a joke. Nevertheless, as a result of what the police found, Mills and Bennett were arrested and charged with conspiracy to cause explosions. Next day, BBC Television News broadcast a warning from the police.
Scotland Yard have just issued an appeal for information about a car connected with an alleged bomb plot. They believe the car, a beige Fiat 124 Saloon, registration number XTP753J, could be in the London area. The public are urged not to go near or touch the car, but to call the police immediately if they spot it. Tonight's appeal comes as a young couple were charged with conspiring to cause explosions following a police raid on a Bayswater flat earlier this week.
In fact, the car was found a few days later at the bottom of a cliff in South Wales. It had been driven there by Dafforth Ladd, who'd seen the warning on BBC Television News and panicked. Ladd himself was arrested soon after and also charged with conspiracy to cause explosions. His fingerprints had been found in Mills and Bennett's flat. But some of the police looking into the case were concerned that they may have jumped the gun a bit. After all, there hadn't actually been any explosions. The evidence generally was pretty thin. Until, that is, they picked up Ladd's prison friend, Stuart Carr. Under interrogation, Carr made a long confession. There was indeed a group, he alleged, committed to a bombing campaign. In Redchurch Street in East London, they'd opened a kind of workshop and headquarters, he said. But much more interesting to the police was Carr's information, with names, that they'd organised a whole series of robberies to provide themselves with money and weapons. But there was still no real evidence. When the police searched the premises at Redchurch Street, again they found nothing. The police began to check out the people named in Carr's statement. Vince Stevenson from Rising Free was one. Stevenson took 2 days to give the police his address, and when they finally got it out of him and went there, they could hardly believe their luck. By a bed was a hold-all full of arms and ammunition, a treasure trove of evidence, the jackpot, as one policeman exclaimed at the time. The charge of conspiracy to cause explosions, which had always looked pretty thin, was dropped, and the police now concentrated on conspiracy to rob. As a result of their surprise find in Stevenson's flat, there was one more arrest, a friend of his from Rising Free, Trevor Dorton. He had the key of the hold-all in his pocket. His name was added to the list of those charged with conspiracy to rob, and so now there were 6. Mills and Bennett, the Black Cross anarchists, Ladd and Carr, the Black Aid German supporters, Stevenson and Dorton from the Rising Free bookshop. From the outset, the trial itself was controversial, not least because of the decision to vet the jury. When the Guardian newspaper published the results of the vetting, a full-scale inquiry was started to find out who'd leaked it. The Old Bailey trial was the culmination of an immense amount of time, effort and expense, surveillance, collecting evidence, changing the charges. The determination to get them all into court was positive in the extreme. But as today's acquittals prove, in this particular skirmish between the anarchists and the authorities lost. Though there's no doubt that the confrontations will continue, because it's not so much the message that Stuart Christie sends south in his Black Flag newspaper that concerns the authorities. It's the way the paper keeps open the lines of communications between so many different international groups. For many years, these groups have been able to frighten governments out of all proportion to their men.
Morning, Joy.
Hello, Stuart.
More parcels? Denmark?
There are those who dearly like to see the Sunday postmistress handle a much lighter burden.